Liam, very much for organizing the online seminar series. It's been just a fantastic venue. And thanks for having us present our work. So as Liam mentioned, the title of this work is The Institutional Sources of Economic Transformation, Energy Policy from the Oil Crises to Climate Change. And this is joint with Phillip Lipscy, Jonas Meckling, and Florence Metz. And Florence is here with us today. Whoops, there we go. So this work is motivated by our thinking and theorizing about, or trying to think through and theorize the politics of significant policy reforms. And so the key question for us is, when can governments intervene to transform the economy? And we call these economic transformations, and we conceptualize these as policy-driven structural changes that fundamentally and sustainably reconfigure economic activity. Now, given our research interests, we're interested specifically in the cases of energy transition and decarbonization, but we're hoping that, there are many other types of economic transformations that governments can undertake, and we're hoping that this theory is generic enough to apply to a broader set of cases. So the first part of the argument is that governments basically have two types of policies that they can use to undertake these sorts of transformations. Demand side policies, which target consumers and try to get households to change their behavior. And then there are supply side policies, which target firms and producers and try to get business to change their behavior. And so importantly, both of these sets of policies will impose costs on some set of losers on both the producer and the consumer side. And so the challenge then, Political Economy 101, the challenge will be overcoming opposition from both consumers and producers that stand to lose from significant policy reform or economic transformation. Now, we argue that to overcome the losers, there are basically two strategies that governments can employ. And we think these are the kind of, the only two. So curious what folks think. But the first thing governments can do is they can try to insulate the policymaking process from the losers. That is, reduce the access of the losers to sort of policy design, sort of the politics of policy design. That is, to put it crudely, sort of ignore the losers, shut them out, steamroll them. Now, if governments can't insulate the policymaking process, we argue they can compensate the losers. And what compensation does, and of course there are many different ways that governments can compensate the losers, but what they all do is reduce the cost of transition for the losers, i.e. pay them off and try to sort of get their buy-in. Now, if governments can't do either of these things, we argue they'll retreat and they'll fail to adopt reforms and they'll essentially give up. Now, just to illustrate the arguments with the decision tree, so the government wants to adopt a significant policy reform. Can the government insulate from the losers? If yes, we get reform. If no, can the government compensate the losers? If yes, we get reform. If no, we argue there'll be retreat, no reform. And we can see here that we expect a sort of observationally equivalent outcomes, right? But via two different mechanisms. So we get policy change, but it happens via two different strategies. The idea that many roads can lead to Rome. So undoubtedly, we recognize that many different variables will shape whether governments can insulate or compensate in response or as strategies for major policy reform. We focus on the role of institutions. And we argue that, we recognize that institutions aren't the sole cause of outcomes, but what they do is they mediate distributional struggles and therefore provide opportunities for structural reform and also constraints to it. And we look at four institutions in particular, which we have sort of theoretical priors that these are important. So in terms of generating capacity for insulation, on the demand side, we look at electoral rules. On the supply side, we look at bureaucratic autonomy. And in terms of compensation, on the demand side, we look at the welfare state, and on the supply side, we look at corporatism. Now, I'll give you a very sort of an abstraction from our theory, very high level, but happy to talk more about the details in the Q&A. So first, looking at the mechanisms for insulation. So as I mentioned, we think electoral rules are important here, especially proportional electoral rules, because there's evidence that suggests that PR rules reduce electoral competition and they tend to reduce electoral accountability. So we argue this can generate insulation from voter backlash for politicians and lead to more ambitious demand-side reforms. Governments are better insulated from households or from voters. In terms of insulation from on the producer side, we think autonomous bureaucracies are important. And here we're thinking of strong state ministries or departments that are able to undertake sort of technocratic policy agendas apart from influence from elected officials or special interests or the courts. And when governments delegate significant policy reforms or transformational policy reforms to these ministries, we think that the policymaking process should be more insulated from producer influence and therefore lead to more ambitious supply side reforms. Moving on to the institutions for compensation. So we think the welfare state here is very important, especially on the demand side. What social policy can do is it can compensate, can provide diffuse compensation for consumers to ease the adjustment and ease the costs of reforms to households, and therefore, again, enable governments to undertake more radical reforms on the demand side. And then lastly, we argue that corporatism is important for compensating producers. Why? Because we argue it can reduce the transaction costs of negotiations. So it can reduce the time and energy it takes for governments and industry to arrive at sort of credible and satisfactory compensatory bargains, and therefore, again, enable the government to undertake more radical supply side reforms. So, as I've already mentioned, we test this in the case of energy transitions. And we conceptualize energy transitions as structural energy reforms that aim to transition entire societies from one energy production and consumption trajectory to another. And we examine one period of particularly vigorous energy reforms, and that's countries' responses to the 1970s oil price shocks. And here's just some data on the oil price going back to 1950. And indeed, we see very clearly these two shocks in 73 and 79. Now, the goal for the research design is to test whether countries' responses to the price shock is conditional on their domestic institutional environment. And we think these price shocks are an ideal setting to do this, partly because, or mainly because methodologically, it's hard to estimate the effect of institutions because they don't change very often within countries. And so what we get with the price shocks is this nice exogenous variation, an exogenous common shock that hits all the countries at the same time. And what we see as well is that governments express similar preferences to act, to do something in response to the shock, to reduce their dependence on oil. However, outcomes vary quite dramatically across the OECD countries or the high-income democracies. And so we see this as a kind of quasi-experimental setup to get some good analytical leverage to test our arguments. We undertake a number of different methods, so quantitative and qualitative. So we do difference and difference, use a difference and differences approach, generalized synthetic control, case studies, and network analysis. The period is from 1965 to 1985, and we look again at the 18 OECD countries of the time. Now, there are two dependent variables. So on the demand side, we look at the gasoline tax rate. So indeed, price mechanisms, especially taxation, was a key policy lever for governments to try to reduce oil consumption by households. Then on the supply side, we look at the amount of electricity that is generated in the grid, throughout the grid, which is from oil as a percent of total electricity. And here, this is basically a measure of the extent to which a country's electricity system is dependent on oil. Now, then for the quantitative analysis, we generate two independent variables. So to test the demand side arguments, we code countries that either have PR or a generous welfare state as one. And so these are countries with that can either insulate or compensate to secure policy reforms. They get a 1, countries without these institutions get a 0. And then on the supply side, we give countries a 1 if they have an autonomous bureaucracy or high levels of corporatism, again, whether they can insulate or compensate. So jumping right in to the results. So here are the difference and differences results. And what we have as the sort of treatment is a time dummy for the oil price shock, and then an institutional dummy that I just described. And what we see on the supply side is that countries with supply side institutions that we argue should give them capacity to generate or to reform the electricity sector in this case, we see those countries reducing the generation from oil by about 8 or 9%. And that's relative to a sample mean of 19%. So quite a substantive effect. And then on the demand side, we see countries with the demand side institutions that we think are important. We see these countries after the oil shock increasing the gasoline tax rate by 8 or 9 cents a liter. And this is relative to a sample mean of about 17 cents a liter. So again, some substantively, we think, meaningful effects here that these institutions are having. Now, we also do generalized synthetic control, and I don't have time to go into exactly what this method is, but essentially we look at the difference between a treated group of countries, and that's this dark line here. So this is countries that have institutions. So in this case, on the supply side, either a autonomous bureaucracy or high levels of corporatism, so they can either insulate or compensate. And we see, and we compare them to a counterfactual, which is generated from a weighted average from a donor pool of countries. And what's important in this figure is just to see that before the price shock, we don't see any real difference between the treated group and the counterfactual. But after 1973, after the first price shock, we see this nice difference opening up. And we see countries, the treated group of countries, reducing their dependence or their use of oil in the electricity sector quite quickly and quite dramatically compared to the control group. And the results are broadly similar when we look at the demand side. So here, the outcome is the gasoline tax rate. And again, what we see is before the price shock, we see nice. We don't see really any difference between the treated and control group, but then after the price shock, we see this we see that the treated countries increase tax rates quite dramatically and quite quickly compared to the control group. Now, we also undertake some comparative case study work, and this is the process trace, the causal processes we hypothesize are at work here. Admittedly, our measures of institutions are quite blunt, right? We're using just dummy variables. And so here is an effort to try to get some more analytical leverage. And what we do is we pick 3 countries which vary quite a bit when it comes to the institutions that we're interested in. So in these first 4 columns, we get quite a bit of nice variation. So the countries are France, Germany, and the UK. I won't go in detail about what we actually observe in terms of demand side and supply side transitions, but the results are broadly consistent with our theoretical arguments. France takes a sort of technocratic approach, a statist approach, a very strong and insulated bureaucracies are able to steamroll opposition and move the country quite quickly to nuclear. For Germany, it's a negotiated corporatist bargain between labor unions, the state, and industry. Then in the UK, we get efforts to do something, or sort of intentions to do something, but efforts fall short, and in the end, we see policy reversal and retreat. We also do some network analysis, which I will skip over, but we can talk about it in the Q&A if folks are interested. But again, we look at sort of the demand side and the supply side, and the results there again are broadly consistent with the arguments. So to conclude, there are 2 mechanisms we think that enable economic transformation: insulation and compensation. And we argue that institutions shape the capacity for governments to pursue either one of these mechanisms or both of them on both the demand side and the supply side. I presented some evidence from energy transitions, and we think these these mechanisms, insulation and compensation, still matter quite a bit today, especially for the politics of decarbonization. And we point to some recent work by ourselves and others that highlight, or what we think that highlight the continued importance of these mechanisms. So with that, I'll end. Thanks very much.